Welcome to the channel. I am the Film Symbologist. This is the 30th installment of the Prometheus series where I discuss Ridley Scott's 2012 science fiction film. In this episode, I will take a brief look at the so-called last engineer, who makes an appearance in the final act of the film. What role does this being play in the story? Why does he react the way he does? What's his deal? These questions will be looked at through the lens of various mythological traditions to hopefully illuminate the character's curious behavior. Back in episode 9, I discussed Mary Shelley's early 19th century Gothic horror novel Frankenstein. In both stories, mad alchemy-inspired scientists experiment with forbidden knowledge. The engineers have their black goo pathogen, which accentuates the survival traits of creatures it comes into contact with, and Victor has his mysterious method of reanimating dead matter into monsters of great size and strength. Towards the end of Shelley's story, Frankenstein's obsessive ambition brings him to a barren place in the Arctic, far from his European home, where he ends up frozen on a sheet of ice. Likewise, the LV-223 engineers find themselves on a remote moon world that is not their home. The last engineer is awakened from 2 millennia in hypersleep by the crew of the Prometheus ship, just as Victor was rescued and thawed by the crew of a passing vessel on an expedition to the Arctic. Even on his deathbed aboard the ship, Frankenstein is unable to overcome his desire to pursue his work. And upon being awakened, the last engineer almost immediately continues his planned mission. Both Victor and the last engineer die while holding on to their ambitions. In episode 25 of the series, I discussed the Divine Comedy, Dante Alighieri's 14th century Italian epic poem that recounts the author's fictional journey through Inferno and Purgatory to paradise. In the late 19th century, French artist Auguste Rodin was commissioned to sculpt the Gates of Hell. Based on the first section of Dante's poem, the 20-foot-tall monumental bronze doorway features a complex scene with dozens of figures of varying sizes. In the center of the sculpture, above the door panels, sits Rodin's thinker. Striking a contemplative pose, the prominently displayed figure appears deep in thought. He also bears a resemblance to the last engineer, who awaits the Weyland Corporation crew at the end of a series of doors, thresholds, and passageways. As symbolized by the sculpture, the prideful internal focus on one's own intellect is one of the major contributors to rebellion against the created order of the cosmos. It's a quality that contributed to Adam's fall. It's what underlies many of the sins of that first man's descendants. And it's one of the defining characteristics of Satan, the eternally tormented and unrepentant being that sits at the bottom of hell. In episode 29, I compared David, the android son of the self-proclaimed god Peter Weyland, to Zeus's demigod son Heracles. In some ancient Greek traditions, it is said that Heracles freed the Titan Prometheus from his chains. While Scott's film depicts David releasing the last engineer from his hypersleep chamber, the giant being also destroys the android, which is not something that happens in the Greek story. Prometheus doesn't kill Heracles. Perhaps other stories can help to better inform who the last engineer is, and why he does what he does. In episode 10, I drew connections between the LV-223 engineers and Olympian gods like Apollo, Dionysus, and Zeus. Whereas Prometheus's gift of fire seems to have been intended to assist man, Zeus's subsequent order to create the first woman, Pandora, and to give her a jar filled with evils seems more like a punishment. In the film, the opening of the urns of black goo in the pyramid certainly resulted in terrors and death being unleashed on the human crew members. Despite survivors from the Weyland Company witnessing these evils on the moon, they continue onward with their expedition. Once the contents of the urns are released, it seems nearly impossible to contain them. And just when it seems like the black goo will be exported from the moon and delivered to the entire population of life on Earth, Yannick manages to ensure that the jars are closed. And like with the Greek myth, what remains in the end of Scott's film is hope. But is this a false hope? What can we learn from looking at the Alien franchise? Shaw leaves LV-223 with a sense of hope given to her by David, but in Covenant we see that her trust was misplaced. In Alien, the audience can feel optimistic after Ripley expels the xenomorph out into the vacuum of space. The horror appears to be over. But in Aliens, humans immediately return to the moon the Nostromo crew explored, and the Weyland-Yutani Company establishes a colony, which unleashes more xenomorphs. Ripley returns the LV-426 with colonial marines and is seemingly able to put an end to the aliens once again. In Alien Romulus, the audience sees that the xenomorph is able to survive in space by cocooning itself, making it practically indestructible. Yet that film's main character is able to persevere, and the film ends on a hopeful note. Does anyone want to make a bet on what kind of hope that is, and how long it will last? As for The Last Engineer, his actions towards the crew still seem abrupt, even in the deleted version. What else might ancient stories have to say about this scene? The Last Engineer may have even incurred the wrath of gods like Zeus. In Greek mythology, Sisyphus was a tyrannical king who was willing to kill visitors and guests in order to display his power. This violated the sacred tradition of hospitality, which angered the gods. It was also said that Sisyphus cheated death, not once, but twice, which added to the gods' ire. As punishment for his trickery of others, the tyrant was sent to the Tartarus section of Hades, the underworld, and was forced to repeatedly roll an enormous boulder up a hill for eternity, because every time it approached the pinnacle, it would roll back down the hill, undoing any progress he may have made. When David discovers the Last Engineer, he is 2,000 years into his eternal imprisonment on the desolate moon world. Having escaped death from the so-called outbreak on LV-223, the Last Engineer avoided the same fate as his fellow engineers, but his mission was thwarted, or at least postponed. When he is awakened by David, the Last Engineer seems to share Sisyphus's views on showing hospitality towards visitors. And barely missing a beat, the engineer resumes his mission, only to have his plans once again squelched, this time by Yannick. But the engineer manages to escape death once again, as his boulderous ship rolls back down into the bottom of the valley. Let's see what Ridley Scott has to say about this scene in the making of Prometheus documentary, Furious Gods.
When it rams it, guess what? It doesn't destroy it. It comes down, bounces, it bowls it. So it goes down, hits the ground, starts to roll like a frisbee across the landscape, and then rolls after them.
In a fit of vengeful rage, the Last Engineer chases after Shaw, but he is unable to escape death a third time, and his relentless drive is finally subdued by the grip of the trilobite. One way to think about the proto-facehugger is as a demigod, the offspring of the engineers and mortal women. In Vickers' suite, which doubles as a lifeboat, the young hero protects and avenges its human mother from its rageful divine father. This should provide some additional insight into the engineer's treatment of the crew, beyond what has been presented in previous episodes. Prior analyses focused on the LV-223 engineer's view of mankind as weak and inferior, and Weyland's unnatural creation of a golem in his own image, along with his sense of entitlement to gifts from the engineers. While these explanations help us to understand the Last Engineer's behavior, More can be said about the choice to include a beheading, and not just in this scene, but in several other instances throughout the film. In the ancient world, beheading could symbolize several things. It was seen as a way of removing one's authority, leadership, power, and influence. It represented the end of one's lineage and legacy, and it was a way of appeasing the gods and providing divine justice. In Scott's film, an engineer is beheaded by one of the gates of hell in the pyramid on LV-223. This symbolizes the way of life, civilization, and lineage of these engineers being cut off and severed. In a different scene, a pile of dead engineers are shown stacked up against another gate, reminiscent of a punishment in the 9th level of Dante's Inferno. The domed structures themselves are topped by a sculpted skeletal head. It was argued back in episode 20 that near this Golgotha, this place of the skull just beyond the perimeter wall, the ultimate sacrifice was made for the sake of others, and a punishment was delivered to LV-223, which prevented the moon's inhabitants from completing their plan. It's also fitting that in the ampule room is another massive head sculpture. The LV-223 engineers were consumed by their own intellects, and so their plan was relegated to the purely propositional, a hypothetical, not something that is destined to be carried out and embodied in the flesh. 2 millennia later, the ambitious Prometheus expedition embarks on a mission to the distant moon. The logo for the Weyland Corporation is a winged sun, like the wings of Horus from ancient Egypt, which represented divinity, royalty, and the power of order over chaos. The logo is also reminiscent of the icon for the Rosary of Philosophers, which is a 16th century collection of wise alchemical sayings. In the film, the Prometheus expedition attempted to establish their own order on LV-223, but all they managed to do was act as a chaos agent that unleashed an evil that led to nearly everyone's destruction. Power cannot bring balance between order and chaos. Instead of Peter Weyland exerting his influence, the last engineer cuts off the head of the Weyland Corporation by killing the Titan of industry. This, along with the death of Vickers, leads to the collapse of the company and allows it to be acquired by the Yutani Corporation after the events of the film. In a prior video, I mentioned how David from the Bible beheads Goliath, representing God's victory over the Philistines. Yet in the film, the giant engineer is the one to behead the android David. The mythological figure of Perseus may offer some additional insight. While Perseus may have roots dating all the way back to Proto-Indo-European tradition, in Greek mythology he is the son of Zeus and the mortal woman Danae, and is depicted as the heroic slayer of monsters. With the aid of Hermes and Athena, Perseus slays the serpent-headed Medusa by decapitating her, symbolizing triumph over chaos and monstrous evil. In Prometheus, it is the engineer's will that prevails over the chaos brought by the Weyland Corporation. But as indicated by Fifield's failed attempt at beheading the serpentine Hammerpede, in the end, chaos appears to wield ultimate authority over everything, even the engineers. But then again, appearances can be deceiving. Hopefully this episode has provided some additional context for the last engineer, his treatment of the crew members, and the theme of beheading in Ridley Scott's 2012 film. In the next episode, I will discuss the space jockey pilot from 1979's Alien, and how it relates and connects to Prometheus. If you enjoy content like this, like the video, comment down below, and subscribe to the channel. For early access to new content, consider becoming a member of the YouTube channel or Patreon. Information about how to join is in the video description. This is the Film Symbologist. Thanks for watching.